Joining me now is conservative commentator and, of course, Fox News presenter with his own Tucker Carlson show tonight. Tucker, good to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Nigel.
Well, it's very interesting. Now, you're one of those conservative commentators who, in the past, has been pretty critical of the neocons, those that want to bomb everybody and go to war constantly, and you've made some pretty principled stands on that. How did you feel when Trump launched missile attacks in Syria?
Distressed. Like I was watching a hostage situation where someone was being compelled to do something against his own principles. And perhaps I'm just projecting that onto what I saw, and Trump was completely in favor all along of launching another pointless war with no benefit for the United States. But I doubt it. I think he was talked into it against his better instincts. It's precisely the sort of thing that he ran against.
Yes.
And you'll notice that nobody even bothered to explain why the United States would benefit from the move, which is telling.
Is this, all those years ago, Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex. Maybe he was a few decades ahead of his time, but is it just that powerful? Is the state that powerful that it even persuades a very strong-minded man like Donald Trump to kind of change his mind?
Well, I think conservatives, and his instincts are conservative, are always susceptible to the argument that we need to do this because America needs to restore order in the world. And that's not a crazy argument, and it does apply accurately to some scenarios, in my opinion. But I think it was a combination both of the entrenched interests that you just referred to. Also, there are ideological interests. There are foreign governments that have an interest in it. There are a lot of different pressure points being applied. Certainly there are countries in the world in whose interest it would be to destabilize the Assad government, who believe it's in their interest, and they applied pressure, allies of the United States. But I also think, once again, that conservatives in the U.S. have been trained over time to sort of have this default position. When there's a problem in the world, their assumption is the United States can solve it with force.
Yeah.
And if that were true, I would be in favor of it. I'm not against force on principle. I'm not committed to peace for its own sake. War is necessary under certain circumstances. But we've seen the limits of U.S. power, and we've seen more than anything how complex and confusing the world can be.
Well, hey, and Tucker, we've been with you all the way through, haven't we? We were there in Libya, we were there in Iraq, we've been there all the way through in Afghanistan. So it's kind of, we're having a similar debate over here, and
it's a debate worth having. But what I find so striking, and I think you and I are likely on the same side. I know we're on the same side of this, but it's how assiduously people worked to prevent that debate from being held. So last night, just to name one example, in the House of Representatives here in the U.S., there was a vote basically on whether to authorize preemptively force against the government of Iran. Now, it's not a defense of the Iranians to say, well, maybe we should talk about this in public and talk about what the objectives for this might be and our capacity to pull it off. And, let's talk about it. Nope. No public conversation whatsoever. And that's the result of massive lobbying efforts to prevent the conversation from being had.
Yeah, no. But isn't it funny in one way that, there was Trump going around America, speaking in these big stadiums, 20,000 people turning up. And, of course, I was there. I spoke with him on one of these basketball stadiums down in Mississippi. What was really interesting was he was putting this America First argument. It's time we had a government that actually stood up and represented ordinary people. And that was portrayed by so much of the liberal media establishment that kind of America's, rather like Brexit was, America's pulling up the drawbridge. We won't engage with the wider world. Isn't the remarkable thing that here we are, nearly 18 months into a Trump presidency, and actually it's what he's done globally, I think, that's made more news than what he's done domestically.
That's often the case. He didn't plan for that. I don't think he sought it. But it's pretty easy to, in effect, entrap an American president in foreign entanglements if you make the case that, look, you have no choice. You run America. You're the head of a global empire that keeps the shipping lanes open and is a beacon of light to the rest of the world, and this is your moral obligation. You have to do this. You have no choice.
Yeah.
And it takes someone who really has thought it through to resist that and to say, no, actually, in a lot of cases, don't just do something, stand there is the right response.
But he has done some good stuff, in my view. I mean, I have to say, when I see Boris Johnson and going along with the big bosses in Brussels and saying that no, the Iran nuclear deal is a great deal and it should remain in place, I think Trump was absolutely right to get rid of that deal.
I don't think there's any defending the deal from an American or maybe even English perspective. It was not negotiated with the interests of the West in mind. It was negotiated in bad faith by the Americans, by the Obama administration. And so, I'm not defending the deal. The concern is that scrapping the deal is a move preparatory to a war with Iran or a series of proxy wars in Lebanon and Syria against Iran. And that's the worry. And I think that's a legitimate worry. I know the people who are pushing for war with Iran. I know them well. In some cases, I worked with them. And I know their objectives. I know the intensity they bring to achieving those objectives. And I'm very worried about that.
What about North Korea? I mean, he has achieved... I mean, has this kind of talking tough, not appeasing, waking the world up to the threat that North Korea posed, it's been kind of effective, really, hasn't it?
Yes, but I think in ways that people are missing. I think the key was the saber rattling on trade with China. So we allowed China into the WTO in in the fall of 2001, and we lost 6 million American manufacturing jobs. China has cheated on the terms of that agreement ever since, and no American administration, Republican or Democrat, has ever called them out on it. And Trump did. And that actually got the Chinese where they live. That worried them. And so they almost immediately laid down the law with the Kim regime. I mean, I think what you're seeing is a Chinese response to an economic threat as manifest in U.S.-North Korea relations. So that's my read on it.
Yes, I mean, my read is that the Chinese acted, that actually the sanctions on North Korea became very real, and that's kind of what's got them to negotiate. But it is a victory for Trump to have set that process off. But how's he doing? I mean, all we ever talk about over this side of the pond is what Trump is doing internationally. We've not really, since tax reform went through back in December, we haven't talked much about his standing in America. But just share with us, Tucker. I mean, from what I can see, his popularity ratings are improving. And whilst the midterms are going to be tough, he's not in a bad place, is he?
Better than he's been in a year and a half, almost a year and a half in office. And I think that's the result of the Democrats overplaying their position. I mean, the only topic of conversation in the United States at any level is the Russia investigation. Trump, as you know, collaborated with Vladimir Putin to secretly steal the election from him.
Well, of course, as I did on Brexit, of course. You understand that, Tucker, don't you? I mean,
yes, you did. I believe Marine Le Pen was in on that conversation as well.
It's all part of the conspiracy, you know.
It's unbelievable. Once you were finished killing President Kennedy, you got right to work with the Russians. And they've been making that case. Look, their argument has been that Trump is irresponsible, Trump is unfit for the presidency. Okay, that's a real case. But rather than sort of be responsible and highlight their sort of sober, thoughtful decision-making in contrast to Trump's ad hoc Twitter craziness, they've gotten even crazier than Trump, even more irresponsible than Trump. Trump has driven them off the edge. This week, Democrats were literally in public defending the Salvadoran street gang MS-13, the most violent organized crime
I just can't believe that. I mean,
But that's how bonkers he's driven them. And it's fascinating to watch. And so they've overplayed it to such an extent that even voters who are worried about Trump look at the Democrats and say, you're not a good alternative.
And clearly, traditionally, the midterms are tough for any incoming president. I mean, how do you assess? I mean, the Senate doesn't look so bad, but how do you assess Trump and the Republicans' chances with the House this November?
I mean, I think it's going to be difficult. The map doesn't look good. You've had literally dozens of Republican incumbents retire or announce retirement from the House. So that, gives an advantage, a dramatic advantage to Democrats right there. I do think if the Republicans were smart, and obviously they're not smart, probably the dumbest party ever constituted.
Oh, there's competition around the Western world for that. But
There might be. I can only speak to my country. But they could make the case that, look, Trump is flawed. Obviously, the flaws are demonstrable, but the other side is crazy and irresponsible, and they hate you. And if you give them power, they're going to wreck the country, which I think is a fair case to make. If they were to make that, I think they could do pretty well. Democrats are, as I said, already making that case for them. I think it's possible that Republicans hold on to the House of Representatives, in which case you will see a civil war in the Democratic Party. What do you say if you're Nancy Pelosi and you spent the last 2 years telling your voters that Trump is so unacceptable that he can't possibly get reelected? By the way, he's on his way to jail. And then his party keeps the House? What do you tell your voters?
Yeah, that would be fascinating. And in terms of democracy, Tucker, and I know you care about this as much as I do, you've got Fox News. You're there. You're a presenter. It's a private company. It has its editorial line. And similarly, we've got CNN, a company with its own editorial line. And that's kind of part of the Democratic debate. I tell you what's worrying me. I met up with Mark Zuckerberg just recently, and Facebook, which is massive, of course, isn't it? Hundreds of millions of Americans and people on this side of the pond signed up to Facebook. And so many of our young people are forming their views from what they get on Facebook, Twitter, and other forms of social media. But this Zuckerberg character, so he says that Facebook is there and it's a neutral platform for all ideas. And yet I can see with what they've done with the algorithms that they are now actually running Facebook with a bias towards a centre-left perspective. What are we going to do about this, Tucker? Because these people are so powerful. Is there a case for legislation of some kind?
Well, there's an obvious case to break up Facebook and Google tomorrow, and a government that cared about its own country would do that. Facebook and Google represent a choke point through which almost all human information flows.
Yeah.
Facebook is the largest news provider in the history of the world.
Yeah.
It's also the least transparent and the most stealthy and feline in the way that it operates. It exercises censorship on behalf of totalitarian governments around the world. It would do anything to get back into China, including squelching the opinions of the opponents of the Chinese government. It's a force for bad around the world, posing as a force for liberation.
Yeah.
And by the way, it has too much power. It's a challenge to government, actually. And if Facebook isn't a living antitrust violation, then the term has no meaning. And it really reflects poorly on the Republican Congress that they haven't done anything about it because they're kind of Ayn Rand conservatives who think that private industry can never be regulated in any way. This is a public trust that is subverting democracy itself, and it ought to be broken up.
I'm very worried about it over the course of the next few years. I really, really am. And Tucker, finally, are the good guys winning?
The lines have been, it's hard to know. I mean, of course, I'm temperamentally conservative, and so I'm a pessimist. By nature. So, no, I mean, of course, I think, I'm stockpiling weapons in a cabin in the woods.
Of course.
But I think the lines have, here's the good news is the last thing I'll say. The good news is it's now clear what the argument is about. It's not a left-right argument. It's an argument about speech and democracy and the right of average people to have their voice heard and have some say in the way they live. And that wasn't clear 2 years ago, before Brexit and before Trump, and now it is. And so it's just good to know what the terms of the debate are. You've got a better chance of winning if you know what you're arguing for.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. We are at last having the right debate. And hey, you're right there in the middle of it. Tucker, thanks for coming on. Farage against the machine is what we're called, because I've spent my life fighting against the machine, and I'm going to go on doing so.
We will make America great again.